We're going to continue our discussion on poetry and poetic elements today. I made a video in the past about some of the elements of figurative language. You can watch that video if you click here. You should probably watch that video first if you're not sure what figurative language is. But there are lots of elements of figurative language. There are a lot more than even this video has. This lesson is not about defining what figurative language elements are. It's about why poets use them in their poetry. We're going to be looking at a poem and creating a T-chart to determine what are the elements of figurative language in this poem and what is the purpose of that element of figurative language. The poem I picked was Fire and Ice by Robert Frost. When you have an assignment or an AP test that's asking you to analyze a poem, the first thing you should do is just read the poem. Figure out what the mood is of the poem, how it makes you feel, what some of the imagery and poetic elements that you might have noticed right away in the poem, what is the structure of the poem, and then where is the tension, what's the lesson, what's the struggle in the poem. So let's go ahead and read the poem Fire and Ice by Robert Frost.
Fire and Ice by Robert Frost. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favour fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction ice is also great, and would suffice.
So when you first read, just get a sense of what the poem's about, figure out how it makes you feel. For me, this poem has this hopeless, beautiful element to it. It also seems really casual despite the fact that we're talking about the end of the earth or the end of humankind. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is create a T-chart and try to identify some of these poetic elements, this figurative language in the poem, and then determine what do I think the purpose was of using that figurative language. And if you have the poem in front of you on paper, I like to actually draw right there on the paper. Before we get started, know that there's a link in the description, and also on the Canvas class, there's a link for an example of how we're going to be doing this assignment with the Robert Frost poem. So once I read the poem, I like to determine first if I noticed an obvious structure or rhyme scheme, and there is a rhyme scheme here. So I'm going to take a handy dandy pencil and mark it out. I noticed right away on the first line that A rhyme is fire, desire, fire. The B rhyme here, the next line down, is ice. Ice, twice, suffice. And there's a small C rhyme here in hate and great. Notice the rhyme scheme when we map it out, there isn't a consistent pattern. In fact, instead of going A, B, C, A, B, C, or A, B, A, B, A, B, C, A, B, A, B, A, B, C, notice it's A, B, A, B, C, B, C, B. It's really inconsistent, and in fact it's kind of chaotic, which makes sense if we're talking about the end of the world. This is a time of chaos. It could also be seen as playful because it's not expected, but every single end line has a rhyme. It all matches up with something, so there is this sense of completion even though it's all over the place. I also notice it's all in one stanza and the line lengths are different. This is also a part of the structure. Now the next thing I might want to do after analyzing the structure is look at some of the elements of poetry and try to figure out what I might recognize here in the poem. You might recognize more than I did, but some things that I picked out is there's definitely personification here. When we talk about fire and ice, they're being personified. Robert Frost here is personifying that ice and fire are destructive, that they're great and they would be enough. In doing that, we also have this obvious juxtaposition where fire and ice are easily being compared throughout the poem. What is worse? What is better? Frost also uses repetition in this poem, and it's really subtle. He's got the line, some say. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. This some say almost sounds really casual. So let's put repetition down on the list. There's also metaphor in this poem. Fire and ice have metaphors attached to them to specific feelings. So he's saying some say the world, some say humanity will end in fire, and some say it will end in ice. And that fire he's comparing in the metaphor to desire, and ice he's comparing to hate. And the idea that humanity is going to be destroyed because of our passions, our desires, or because of our hate, and both of those are destructive things. There's a lot of personification, juxtaposition, and metaphor right there. I also notice imagery in this poem. Now, imagery can be a few things. It can be where they've described something so well that I can picture it. But in this one, the imagery has to do with the sensory detail of taste. because it can also be the senses. So he talks about tasting desire, that from what I've tasted of desire, that what I've experienced, the taste word though puts it on your tongue. This is an element of imagery, so let's mark it. You can easily tell, even from this small poem, we already have quite a list. We've got juxtaposition, imagery, rhyme scheme, personification. Now, one thing I want to say before we even get started on this T-chart of analyzing the purpose of these poetic elements and these literary devices is that the things that I notice in the poem might be completely different from the things that you notice in the poem, and that's perfectly okay. Or you might notice the same poetic elements that I do, but you might feel the purpose of that poetic element is different. Remember that on the AP tests and other essays like this, what we really want to do is see why you think they're using these poetic devices. What is the purpose to you? And it's okay if our purposes are completely different. There's no real such thing as a wrong answer or a right answer. You're making your own leap. So when I say that I feel like the rhyme scheme in this poem is to create a chaotic environment, you might find the rhyme scheme to be playful, and that's okay. As long as you can defend what your stance is, what your leap is, with your own logical, defensible reasoning, you're good to go. I just want to show you the reasoning that I have for the purposes of the poetic elements in this poem. So let's just start with those 6 elements of figurative language. I think those things give us enough to actually write a lot. So let's hit these one at a time. Let's start with personification, number 1. So why is Frost personifying the ice and the fire as destructive? What's the purpose of using this personification? I'm going to write, Frost personifies ice as destructive because he wants us as people to consider the relationship that we have to fire and ice as these two very destructive things that exist in our world. So why did he use the metaphor of fire is actually desire and ice is actually hate? Well, let's put that on the T-chart. He's trying to teach us what he thinks is going to cause the end of the world or the end of humanity. And the two things that he's found are the most destructive in this world are passion and desire, and on the other side, hate and anger. So he uses the metaphor of fire and ice to be compared to hate and desire. So he thinks the end of the world or the end of humanity will be fire because of his own personal experience with desire. He's tasted it. He knows how painful it can be. He knows how destructive it is. Now for the juxtaposition of even comparing them in the first place, let's put that down as number 3. Frost juxtaposes fire, desire, and ice, hate, to help the reader compare the pain of these two things in our lives, the pain of these two things in our world, and to think about how these human emotions can cause so much destruction, and comparing what that destruction feels like and tastes like. Which one is to be the most feared, or they're both equally destructive? Now for repetition, remember we repeated some say, some say. Some say seems really casual. Some say, some believe, there are those who think. It's not this forceful, fearful, end of the world, yikes. There's this casualness about it, and the repeating it is bringing this really big issue kind of down to a human personal level. He's also using this repetition to show that the views of people are divided, that some think this while some think this. So in using this repetition, he's showing some say that we're divided in what our ideas are of the pains of the world. But also he's using it to bring back this doom and gloom topic to a casual, comfortable level of speaking. Even though the topic is pivotal to our survival, the repetition brings the tone back. Okay, number 5 on the list, I've got imagery. Taste is such a powerful sense. When a lot of our experiences of desire come from our mouths, right? The taste of food, the taste of a kiss. And while you might not be able to physically taste desire, there is this element of desires being things that are quite often tasted through kissing, through when you're starving and you really want food, that taking it in and feeling the flavors of it in your mouth. And the imagery of biting into and savoring desire is a beautiful and strong image. I think that emotion sticks out in my head the most after I've read this poem. It helps me remember the experience and the emotion of desire, and I really love the imagery used in the sense of taste here. All right, number 6, the end rhyme scheme. I know I've talked about this already, but what is the purpose that I felt to use this rhyme scheme for? For me, it's chaotic. It doesn't make sense. There's no clear pattern, and yet it has a completion because all of the end rhymes are attached to something. The rhyme scheme in this poem is chaotic. Often rhymes make poems upbeat and friendly and predictable, But this rhyme scheme is unpredictable, just like the feeling of the end of the world is unpredictable. It's chaos, and yet every line is rhymed with a pair somewhere. There is a finality to it. Nothing is left open-ended. Not only does it bring this sense of chaos and unpredictability and closure, but there's also the element of the words that he's choosing to rhyme. There are really important words in the poem, like desire and fire, and ice and suffice. The rhyme scheme is drawing my attention to these words. Suffice. That's a strong word. It kind of brings the sense that we're all doomed if these two emotions are going to continue to exist in this world. Now look at all the information that we have here that we can work with just from 6 elements of poetic devices. Remember, a lot of these ideas are just from my own understanding, and your interpretation might be completely different. But what's important is that you make your own assumption, your own interpretation of why these poetic elements, why these literary devices were used. Creating this T-chart is a really great way to create an analysis of the poem that you can use in a paper. My classes have picked out poems, and now your job is going to be to replace everything in the worksheet below on fire and ice that I've attached and switch it out with the poem of your choice, looking for as many poetic elements as you can, and creating the T-chart to show what was your writer, what was your author's purpose in using that poetic element. Even with a tiny short poem like Fire and Ice by Robert Frost, we could write a 10-page paper on the things we've discussed in this video. So let's get to it and create your own analysis for the poem of your choice.